Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Sorry, I'm starting about 10 minutes late. Sometimes things get in the way, such as crises with your children. But I'm here, and tonight we are going to be talking about tech. We're going to finish off our month of talking about tech tools, and tonight we're going to talk about how you're using tech in your classroom and what are some of the things that you can do to leverage technology in your classroom in a way that goes beyond just using tech as a toy and really moving students forward into using tech as a tool to facilitate inquiry-based instruction in your classroom and make the using of the technology, allowing students to be prepared for their 21st century learning. So I know we've all heard it before. Things like we need to get students ready to learn and get used to using technology so that they can be prepared because they are the 21st century students, and that we need to have tech with students right at the time of instruction, and that we can't necessarily just have tech in a scheduled, say, computer lab time, and how that whole purpose of having a computer lab is starting to fall by the wayside because it's not as responsive as what we need tech to be for our students these days. And I know we've all heard it, and sometimes we can probably justify every time that we can put our students on games and they can play and, they may be learning, or that we really like to have the computer lab because it's a great time for students to actually all be doing the same thing on the tech all at once. And it might be a little bit easier initially for the teacher to manage that. Or maybe we have the lock them up philosophy where you've got tech and you've got a place for all the students to store their technology and it's locked away for them to not be used. And you have tech maybe only one period a week or a couple periods a week, so you have a scheduled tech time. And I'd like to talk about why I think we need to push past these things and why we maybe don't need to be playing games as much on our tech devices, why we shouldn't be locking up students' devices, and why we should be leveraging the fact that they're bringing their own devices into our classroom, and how we can really leverage the minuscule amount of tech that we have so that we can actually program and make it meaningful so that it doesn't become a barrier for students to be successful at using technology and 21st century type tools in the classroom, but how we can really leverage what we do have and plan our day around it and kind of restructure our environment. So you know that I talk about inquiry. So I'm going to do this from an inquiry perspective and share with you kind of some of the ways that you can use tech in your classroom, even if you don't have very much. So again, I actually in my classroom only have 7 iPads for between 18 and 25 students, and that's all that I have. So I have to kind of come up with different ways in order to get my students to be using tech all the time. And realistically, we are on devices all day long for everything. And they're not playing games, although they do have a center sometimes where there might be a game in math centers, but we're not playing games. Technology is used at the point of instruction and it's encouraging. So I really want to talk about how we can do this and leverage the tech. So the first thing I want to talk about is the apps. So I am primarily in iPad classroom. And if you've got other tech tools, you can find apps that are comparable to the ones I'm going to talk about tonight. I actually have an earlier episode where I talked specifically about all of the tech tools and details, and I'll link that into the show notes as they go along with this episode that you can access some of the other ones. I am going to review a few of my favorites in terms of and how I use them in the classroom. So for example, one of the apps that I think is a great one, my primary go-to is Google Suites, and that includes the Docs, the Slides, Drive, and Google Classroom. I rely on those heavily with my students because Google Classroom allows me to have one central storage place for students where they can hand in their digital work. They're not constantly emailing me with me getting their emails lost. I'll be honest, I'm looking at my email inbox right now on my computer, and it says that there's about 5,400 emails that are in there that are giving me the flag. So if I had students emailing me, they certainly would probably get lost. So Google Classroom is definitely a way that helps me manage that time. It also allows me to be able to sync my Google Classroom and their assignments that I create on there with Edocio, which is the markbook software that I use to track most of my grades. If I have a traditional grade book, I'm using Edocio. And new feature is the fact that they allow me to sync information and grades between Google Classroom and Edocio. So I can mark it on the Google Classroom. Students can get that feedback and notes, and then that mark goes automatically synced into my Edocio when I hit the magic button in the Edocio app. So that does make my life a little bit easier. It also allows me with Edocio and Google Classroom to quickly see where students are, and allows me to track them and manipulate that information so that I can get a more in-depth look at what it is. Something that I can't necessarily do without maybe a university statistics level analysis, which I don't remember what I did in university statistics. So I don't want to necessarily go through and make all of that and start charting and charting and gathering data like that. But the fun thing is that Google Classroom, as well as Edocio, and using things like Excel, as well as the data from Google Forms, definitely makes that ability to look at graphs of student data a lot easier. A few other ones that I perhaps didn't get. Christy, Edocio is fabulous. Now, I have to be honest, I don't actually use the day planner in Edocio. Maybe that's a next year goal. I don't use that. The downside of Edocio is that you can't necessarily use it very easily on a laptop, which is a downside. Maybe we can all talk to Edocio about getting a companion website so that we can sync it up to the cloud. That would be nice. Another one that we can use is Explain Everything. Now, I will be honest, after Google Suites, this is my absolute favorite app that can be used on the iPad. It is so versatile. It can be used in so many different ways. Imagine it's like having a smart board and document camera and a video camera and a voice recorder all in one simple app that's really easy for students to use. It's absolutely amazing. Recently, my students just did a fractions project where I simply just gave them the success criteria of what I wanted them to accomplish in fractions, and they had to use Explain Everything to create a task or create an example or show what you know for each one of the success criteria. So they could take pictures of them making fractions with manipulatives. They could draw out their manipulatives and then explain it. They can use a lightsaber pointer to point to certain things on their screen as they're videoing themselves explaining it to them. We threw some iPads on top of chairs, which happened to be standing on tables, and all of a sudden it became a document camera, and they could film themselves converting fractions from mixed fractions to improper fractions. And they were being really resourceful, and they could take a video. They could use their voice and explain. They could use their voice and explain while they were showing a video. It's really versatile and allows me to capture a lot of information that I normally don't get. So Explain Everything is just, it's almost like my go-to app. If I want to capture a student talking and I want to hear what they're thinking, I want to see their process in action, Explain Everything is absolutely perfect for that. And it also syncs up to Google Drive, so you can export all of the work that a student did as a video format or as a PDF, almost like a slideshow presentation, and it goes straight into your documents so that they can share it, and then they can pop it into Google Classroom and they can share it that way. Now, that's called app smashing, which is something that I really encourage my students to do. Sometimes, even though Explain Everything is super versatile, not all of the apps that you're going to use great at every single thing you need to use. So there's a lot of ways that you can app smash, and that just means using multiple apps to accomplish the same task. So I could use Pic Collage to combine a bunch of pictures together. I can throw that into Explain Everything. The student can explain what they're doing on top of that photo that they created in Pic Collage. They can record their voice or record the screenshot video of their face talking about what it is they created. Then they can export it to Drive and drop it into Google Classroom. Now, these are all things that you can't capture by using pencil and paper. And I don't know about you, but sometimes conferencing with 25 kids, all of getting them to show you everything they know is sometimes time consuming, especially if you have a lot of needy kids in your classroom. And sometimes there's just kids that just need to be able to do and move on. And I really like the fact that they can all drop that into Google Classroom. And then I can take just my iPad home as a mark book, as opposed to taking a bucket of marking home. So I keep thinking of these 31 bags, those big, huge, humongous totes that I'm sure many of us have to carry back and forth with all of our marking and all of our binders. So imagine all of that paperwork is just sitting on one small iPad, and your teacher bag has shrunk from this big monolithic bag down to just a regular laptop bag. Now, I'm not knocking those big, huge 31 bags. I've got 3 kids. Those bags are fabulous, but I'm just not using them as a teacher bag anymore because, that would hurt my back, I think, a little bit too much. So trying to get out of the paper and pencil tasks and start using different apps to accomplish new and innovative things is a great way. So the 3 I mentioned there were Pic Collage to combine pictures, going into Explain Everything, and then going into Google Classroom, as well as going into Edocio for your mark book. And that's kind of the workflow with that if you need it that way. Some of the other apps I've used are Book Creator. It allows you to take information and create a book out of it. So if you're looking at publishing student writing, they can write it into Book Creator and finally get to add those photos that they're all desperately wanting to add during the drafting phase. So those are some of the great apps that you can use on an iPad. Now, some of the other ways that iPads have really transformed kind of what is possible in a classroom is it really bumps up your collaboration. So if you have using Google Suites, and this also works with OneDrive or even OneNote or any of the Mac Notes apps as Keynote, you can have the ability to collaborate in real time with somebody else on the same document, but you have 2 different devices. Now, this is just an amazing way for you to have students work together. So if you've got a project and they're doing a PowerPoint presentation, if you have 2 students that are working on the same PowerPoint presentation and say they're using Google Docs, you can actually track to the keynote stroke what each student is contributing. So no longer would you necessarily have a partner activity where you can't mark what each student is doing because there's no way to know what student did what. With Google Docs and with multiple iPads, you can have 2 students working on the same device, and you can really separate out who did what portion of the work. So you can mark who did what. So you can then take a partner activity and then count it towards some assessment, especially if it's just formative assessment. So Chana asked how many iPads in my classroom. I have 7. I have 7 iPads, not including, I have 2 kids with C Acclaim iPads, so they've got their own. I also up that by allowing students to bring their own device. So I have about 4 students that bring in their own device to class. And I fully support that because it means that I am less strapped for what we need. So I've got 7. And I think I had another show where I talked about how I share those, but we will get into it a little bit. 1 or 3-1. I actually don't have a 1-to-1. Yes, it is. I'm very lucky that I have that. If you have a cart, it looks like you've got a cart at 25 that you share around the school. Here's a tip. If you are the classroom where those iPads get charged, it generally means you're going to have more access to them. That's what I learned. If you volunteer to make sure that all of those iPads are charged, if at any point in time they're not signed out, they're yours. An idea. It did work a little bit until we got a little bit more tech now. Each classroom has their own kit in our school, which works so that everybody has some. I wish I had one-to-one, but I don't, unfortunately. Not yet. Maybe 10 more years. Maybe I'll have one-to-one. So you want students collaborating with one another. I think that's really important. So this was most evident to me when I actually had a guest speaker. A couple of years ago, I had a guest speaker in my classroom, and that guest speaker I was a little mortified actually when the guest speaker was in the classroom, because we had two classes and they were all sitting in my room. So the other class was sitting on the carpet in my classroom, and my students were sitting around the perimeter, and they had their devices at this point. And I looked at them and all of their heads were down in their devices. And I went, oh no, none of them are listening. They're all goofing off. How embarrassing is this? I was so worried with what they were doing. So, use those teacher college strategies, go use some proximity and walk over close to them and see if that will kind of get them to pay more attention. So I walked up to them at the back of the room, and I'm looking at their screen and they're typing. And there's words going across the screen on some of the devices, but that student's not actually touching the keyboard. So I'm like, what is going on? So I quickly whispered to one of the students, what are you doing? And she said, oh, we decided all to make one Google Doc, and then we shared it with everybody. And then we're all just adding notes to it as he's talking, so that at the end, we're going to have these notes. These are like 11-year-olds that are doing this, and they were collaborating. They were collaboratively note-taking during a guest speaker, and the quality of their notes that they were taking was just astounding, because they could keep adding, because their problem was that they couldn't figure out how to all be writing that information at the same time, because the speaker was going so fast and they couldn't keep up with what he was saying. Like, I remember at university, sometimes that's hard, right? So here are these 11-year-olds that have decided to join into one collaborative document and note take. Once I realized that, I went from being mortified to being like, oh my gosh, these kids are just amazing. And for me, that was a point where I was like, this is the power of technology in my classroom. This is why it's so important to let them try it out and not necessarily always restrict what's happening with their tech, or when they can and when they can't have it. Because sometimes if they see it as an extension of their learning, sometimes they come up with new and unique ways in order to push what they can do and what the possibilities are with their tech. Stuff that maybe I would never have thought of myself, which is really was a lesson I had to learn really quickly. One of the ways for language that I actually harness the fact that I only have 7 iPads in the classroom and about 20 students is I use a form of open writing. So I've talked about this before, but my writing program, essentially it means that I've got all of my students are really doing genius hour writing all the entire time during language. So when they're writing, it's like a genius hour. So they are choosing what they're going to write about. They are deciding whether or not they want to write fiction or nonfiction. I've got multiple students at multiple times writing lots of different things. They choose their topic in writing. So they talk about all of the different things. So I give them a guideline. So the guideline is I want so many fiction and so many nonfiction over the next couple of months. And that's kind of what I'm expecting for them to be doing. Now, I'll be completely honest. When I went back to work in February, I did a writing survey. I wanted to see what their attitudes were for writing. Overwhelmingly, most of my students said, ugh, I hate writing. It's not my favorite subject. I'd much rather do something else. So that was in February. Today, they were so restless on the carpet today. They were not really interested in continuing our lesson. And one of them looked at me and said, can we go back and start writing now? And I smiled, and all of the other students on the carpet was like, yeah, can we? So now I have a class of students that are begging me for writing time because that's what they want to spend their time with. They choose their own topics. They choose what they're going to write about, whether it is a wrestling story, whether it is a biography on LeBron James. It could be a story about 2 best friends and the conflict they have with a bully at school. They decide what they're going to write about, and then I conference with them about their writing. So I've got all 20 of my students writing something different at different times. And the goal is to just push that individual student's writing one step further every time they write. And I do mini lessons when I'm noticing that there's trends or things that they need to kind of push forward. So looking at how to structure a story, how to research, how to add descriptive language to their writing. And we'll do shared writing activities and other things to boost some of the gaps that I'm noticing collectively as a class. But students are kind of following their own passions, like a genius hour and writing. And this is tremendously improved what writing looks like. Now, for the majority of my students, they're doing this writing all on tech. So I don't have all of my students writing all of the time. There are other activities that they have to do. And strategically, when you pair up students to share one iPad and you have multiple activities that that student needs to accomplish, then the students negotiate between them and their partners which activities they need to do, because only one of them may require a piece of technology. So writing often for some students requires technology. Now, I don't require them to use technology. I do have a handful of students that prefer to handwrite. And honestly, I will often pair those students up with the students that absolutely necessary to use technology to write, so that you have a non-tech writer paired up with a highly needed tech writer. So if I pair those two students up together, there's less of a demand on that device because one student prefers not to use it as often. They also have other activities like word work and reading response, as well as conference time with me and guided reading. So during all of those other times, they're not using tech. So there is a time for them to cycle through and look at what they're using when. So that does allow us to essentially do an open learning type of center. So they start off with rotations, and then eventually we transition them out of doing rotational based centers, and they start doing open learning centers, which essentially means they decide what they need to work on when and manage their time so that they can meet the deadlines that are agreed upon in our classroom. So being able to use the tech in a very flexible way allows me to be able to use as much tech as I can with a small amount of tech, so I can actually use it with all of my students. So they're just constantly kind of rotating and negotiating who's using what, and based on timelines and what they do. And if we are short a few, we always have an agreement with the other teachers that I work with that if my students are short one, they can go around to any of the other classes. And if those iPads aren't being used, they can always borrow, and we borrow and share iPads constantly. So that does kind of help too, that I've got a lot of teachers that work together with me to make sure that that's possible. Now, another way that tech is really handy, again, is with assessment. And it allows me to capture different assessment data. I can take photos of their work. I can store it digitally. I can use things like capturing observations and conversations. My most recent math test, I had a few students that had to communicate the steps on how to use a protractor. Due to their IEP, that communication would be really tough. So I videotaped those students explaining to me and demoing for me how to use a protractor, and used that mark instead. Without the tech, I wouldn't have been able to use that. And that was a really interesting way. And they did really well because it gave them a different way to explain how to use something as a modification there. It allows me to capture conversations between students and track those observation and conversation assessment much more quickly, and storing it in a dossier is a really handy way. The phys ed teacher at my school uses her iPad like she's a genius, the way she uses her iPad to capture their movement and their sportsmanship and all of the other assessment data, which is very visual in the phys ed, and watching and physicality. She captures all of that and stores it all in a dossier, and her dossier just looks amazing. But the way she uses that iPad to capture her assessment data is tremendous. And then she's got a lot of evidence to back up what she writes on the report card. It's also great to use things like Google Forms, like we talked about last week, as well as to use it for the fun Kahoot. That is always a student favorite when they see the Kahoot board come on, so that students can answer kind of summative and formative assessment on that. And finally, the last way that my students most often use it is for research. So we don't have a huge resource library of information that they need to access timely and relevant information that's related to what we're inquiring about, often in science and social studies, or as well as in language, especially if they're writing a biography or a nonfiction text on something that interests them. We may not necessarily have up-to-date books on those topics in our library or accessible to us in our classroom. So allowing us to leverage the technology and using the internet to use research skills so that students can access that information and actually then turn around and write about it or use it is a great thing. And that is one of the ways that it is probably the most impactful for students, is that they can get that research really quickly and easily. It does mean that as a teacher, you have to teach them appropriately how to research and how to sort through different research data. Now, I often use LiveBinder to help give my students a head start, where I will curate research information for them, especially when it's really broad and open, like sometimes science and social studies do. So if you have any of my science and social studies units off of my TPT store, you'll notice that each one of those comes with a LiveBinder resource, so that you can access some of those curated pieces of content that students can use to begin their inquiries and research. And students are getting really good at using Google and learning how to sort through that information and then turn that into writing. You do have to be careful with the plagiarism, but that's a big, huge learning goal for grade 4 and 5, is learning how to write using your own voice and not copying from the text of somebody else. So those are some of the many ways that you can use your iPads or your tech in your classroom, because you could do Chromebooks if that's all you have access to. You can use the tech in your classroom in lots of different ways to make the technology a meaningful tool. It's not simply just a tool that you use to just replace a pencil and paper task. That's kind of not the point. You need to be able to do something with your tech that allows you to push what you can't do with pencil and paper. So you can't easily collaborate with pencil and paper, but you can with tech. You can't often capture observations and conversations with multiple students without that tech, just with a pencil and paper, unless you are there listening. But using a piece of tech like Explain Everything allows you to capture that content for multiple students all at the same time, and then take it with you so that you have that data and evidence. And it's definitely transformed my ability to capture assessment in that moment. So if you're doing a knowledge building circle, you can definitely capture your observations and conversations of that circle through using some of the tech tools that we've talked about tonight. So that is it. And that does sum up our month-long discussion on all things technology as it's related to inquiry. There will be a corresponding blog post just as I finish formatting it and getting it up there tonight. As I said, I went late tonight because some days kids happen. So I will get that blog post up so that you can reference that, and I'll link in there to all of the other resources, including some of the apps that I mentioned and some photos that I'm allowed to share of how I'm using those different tech tools in my classroom. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. Even if we're after live, I'm always there to answer your questions as well about anything that has to do with tech, because I know that today was a bit of a quick summary over everything. You might be overwhelmed, and especially if you're not super tech savvy yourself, and that's okay. So please leave comments in the comment section below the video, and I will do my best to get back to you and answer your questions that way as well. So that's all we have for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. And you can always catch this. If you weren't able to catch the whole thing, you can always watch it on the replay. You can catch it on the podcast at Teaching with Inquiry Live Replay. And you can get that from the show site at www.teachingwithinquiry.com. And this is, I can't even tell you how many episodes we've had. It's been a while. It's been a while. I think we're almost up. We're over a year now of shows. So that's good. So I don't know how many episodes, but it'll be up there on www.teachingwithinquiry.com, including all of the other links that you need to the show notes, the blog post, and the podcast replay, so you can take it on the go with you. Thanks so much, everybody, for all of your comments. I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining me tonight, Erin. I really appreciate that you've come in. If you don't know Erin, you might recognize her from Mrs. Beatty's classroom on TPT. She's got a lot of amazing math centers for primary. So Christy, you're going to primary next year. You should definitely check out Miss Beatty's classroom store on TPT because she's got lots of great stuff on there that I wish she would make for older grades so that I can use them too. Just planting that seed in there, Erin, if you're still in here. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'll see you next week. All next month, we are talking about assessment in time for report cards. So stay tuned. We'll see you next week. Thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye.